Since changing the name of the Eclectic Americana Friday morning drive time radio show on January 20th, 1989 to the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club, the DJs in the collective have strived to entertain and inform our listeners. Airing from 6 to 9 a.m. Pacific at KZSC 88.1 FM in Santa Cruz, California, the Bushwhackers usually have 2 interviews a week, each airing for about half an hour. We're not afraid to ask questions or admit that we don't know something, and we don't mind taking deep dives or following a tangent as we get into how sausage is made in local, county, or state politics, or learning about things going on in our community, or discussions with artists. Our interviews are not scripted and are produced by myself, Dangerous Dan Orange. That.
What's he pressing?
What we can say, pressing? Good morning, KZSC, you're on the air.
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Good morning.
We're doing well. California State Senator John Laird, yet another inch of rain comes into Santa Cruz.
Oh, boy.
Is the season going to end? I don't know.
Can you tell us, John Laird, whether the season will end?
I actually don't have a clue.
But you're the state senator. You have to know when the rain's going to stop.
I'm calling from San Luis Obispo, and yesterday when I drove down from Sacramento, I had to take that high I-5 route and cut over on the James Dean to Paso Robles, and it just poured at different times on that trip, you know.
Well, that's kind of it's not quite as white knuckle as Highway 17, but that stretch of Highway 46 is a little white knuckle as well. I'm glad you made it safely, and yikes.
Tell you what, though, during the rain, that stretch is beautiful.
So you're down in SLO.
It was actually gorgeous,
and
there were certain times that there was just mist off in the distance and in different ways, and the colors were beautiful, but it's a 2-lane stretch that is deadly, and I just played it safe all the way. I was here 2 weeks ago, and I went out into the country to a ranch and was hosted at the Super Bloom here. And so it was this little valley that was just totally yellow with splotches of purple and was just gorgeous. And, you know, they're just different benefits from the fact that we've had all these atmospheric rains.
Right. So if you want to spend a little time admiring flowers, I guess you could head out to Parkfield and that area in 46 and enjoy it. So you're calling in from SLO. Catherine sent us a text asking us if we've ever interviewed Dawn Addis. And I said that we hadn't. And I thought that maybe we could ask Gail Pellerin to help us out. But since both of you, all three of you, are in the Coastal Caucus, maybe we can ask your team to help connect us to Dawn Addis.
I will. I'll see her at 10 o'clock in Pismo Beach. So I will mention it to her. And she, you know, Gail is my assembly member, and I am her senator. But Dawn's district is fully nested inside the Senate district, and her district runs from the Yacht Harbor in Santa Cruz to the San Luis Obispo-Santa Barbara County line. So she has the coast for ages.
So, Senator John Laird, before I ask this, and I'm sort of stealing myself for your response, but it is the KZSC Spring Fundraiser, and we're asking our listeners to point their browsers or whatever digital device they've got to kzsc.fm/give, but if they'd like T-shirts or other swag, kzsc.fm/shop. So, John Laird, when you mention the Bushwhackers to Assemblymember Dawn Addis, how will you describe us or this interview process?
I'll say that once a month I spend a half hour with Dangerous Dan on the radio, and he does a deep dive into any issue. You have to be ready. You have to be ready to just go down into something and explain it at a level of detail that you don't usually have to do, and that I know people listen because they mention it to me all the time.
Okay.
Dan,
okay, now I'll let out my breath.
Stroked just a little bit.
Thank you, Senator John Laird. So, John, I was flipping through the newspaper yesterday on my way back from Houston, and I came across an article where the Florida legislature has decided to set aside the bills that had been submitted to curb, the press shields And I saw, okay, that's a good thing that's been put aside, because I was a little worried about that from freedom of the press standpoint. But as I was reading along, I read that Florida's annual legislative session ends today. And I thought to myself, what? So Senator John Laird, could you imagine the California legislative session for the year ending today?
No, except that is even, you said annual session. The one that I had trouble getting used to,
Texas,
was Nevada.
Oh, go.
Nevada meets for 30 days or 60 days every other year, and they are truly part-time. And they did this in the first year of the Brown administration. They did this horrible bill that said, if California doesn't do these 4 things, we are pulling out of the Lake Tahoe Compact, which is for the environmental future of Lake Tahoe. And 3 of them were complete non-starters. It was switch the voting on the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency so that it doesn't, that environmental projects will be stopped and all this other stuff. And so I called my Nevada counterpart cold and just said, this won't work. But one of these things is to update the general plan, and it hasn't been updated in 25 years. I would pledge to work with you to do that. And in the end, we had a negotiations over a year, marathon ones. We would go up to Tahoe, I think 6 or 7 times. The negotiations went 8 or 10 hours, and we came to a compromise that was unanimously adopted, the first new general plan in 25 years. And then over time, they repealed that law. But the interesting thing is that they had an oversight hearing because they weren't in session with the legislature. And I knew this guy from Las Vegas that was in the legislature, and I called him. And he answered. And I said, well, that's interesting. You're a legislator. I called the legislative number. And he says, well, we're part-time. I just have a phone that rings in my home. And I'm just here, and I answer. And I have no staff. And, and it was just getting you. And then they weren't meeting to be able to repeal the law. They weren't going to meet for another year or some other thing. And so California is really the exception. There are very few legislatures that have full time. And I can't remember when I was on if I explained my brief meeting with Joe Biden when he was in Watsonville. Did I talk about that with you?
I think we did,
briefly,
but
yeah.
Feel free to refresh our memories.
It reflects on this point, which is he was really good. For the 15 or however many of us were greeting him when he landed in Watsonville, we each had a minute or 2. And I went up and sort of said, thank you. We're really in a world of hurt, and we need your help, and you being here is a great thing. But you might not know that California is the only state where there's a legislative district that is bigger than a congressional district. I said, we have almost 1 million people in a state senate district. And he pauses and he says, that's as big as Delaware, which was hilarious. And I thought, great, he's listening. But you see, that's the point. In California, I mean, you have almost 1 million people. You truly are the equivalent of Congress in the sense of how many people you represent, and we're such a huge megalopolis that you have to be current. You have to constantly be fixing things or addressing issues, and in some of these smaller states, they just don't do that.
Well,
and Florida's in the middle. They have an annual session for 90 days or whatever it is, but some of them are really small and really meet intermittently and are truly part-time.
Well, Kaos looked up the annual GDP of California. It's $3.6 trillion. Florida is $1.4 trillion. I don't know if I'd say that's in the middle. That is up there. How can you run an economy of that scale, a state with that many people with a 90-day session per year? And so as a state senator, how would you, how do you prioritize what you have to get done to submit a bill, get it through committee, get it to the floor, herd the cats and get it passed.
Well, yesterday before we left, we had a floor session and we did 5 mid-year budget bills. And one of them had to do with hospitals. And the governor, even though there's a deficit, wants to appropriate $150 million for stress hospitals. And so that is us taking a situation that is a crisis one and addressing it in the moment, not waiting for the time levels of the legislative process or the budget process. And that's what you would hope other states would do. And the thing that's hard is that you have to change a system after a state has really grown. Because I assume Florida's system was set up when it was small and air conditioning hadn't been introduced yet and not many people lived there. And most of the state, except for Miami, was rural. And so they have a legislature that matches that. And they have to have the courage, because people don't want to spend more money and do that stuff. They actually have a constitutional amendment to move. And, California had a part-time legislature till 1966. And they had to go to the ballot and do all this stuff and have a full-time legislature. And the other thing about California at the time that people forget is until the Supreme Court ruled in what was called then one man, one vote, to be one person, one vote. One house, the Senate, was allowed to be apportioned by geography, not population. And California had that system. So in 1965, still, until it changed the next year, Alpine, Inyo, and Mono counties that had something like 12,000 people had senators. And Los Angeles County, that at the time, I think had 7 million people, had one senator. It was completely this. The Assembly was on population, the Senate was on territory, and represented rural, more conservative counties. And so fortunately, the Supreme Court fixed that one, but the voters fixed the full-time legislature so you could, because California had one of those things where every year the session was 60 or 90 days, and it was part-time legislators. And I have right now temporarily coming out of retirement to work for me for 6 months, the son of Jeff Sundrich, majority leader, the guy that I worked for in Congress my first 2 years out of college. And he said he remembers when his father was majority leader in the state assembly and shared an office with somebody else, and they had one staffer. And that's what happened in California when there was a part-time legislature.
Wow. If you're just joining us, folks, we're talking to California State Senator John Laird, KZSC, the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club. I'm Dangerous Dan.
I'm Calamity Kyle.
I'm Chaos.
Please join Catherine and Kathy, who have pointed their digital devices to kzsc.fm/give and donated their generous support to KZSC Santa Cruz.
That's kzsc.fm/give. We're having our spring fundraiser. And we've also got kzsc.fm/shop. We've got a bunch of brand new shirts, some hats, some incredible KZSC swag. So /give or /shop. Pick your poison.
Over to you, Chaos.
Thank you. If you guys are just listening in, we are joined here by Senator John Laird. And if we can go back a minute, you brought up the Tahoe Conservancy bill in Nevada. And the last time that you were here, you also brought up the bill of Sierra Conservancy and how that would change and shift over time. Were there more areas that were able to be added to that? And you said that it was for environmental protection, wetlands restoration, fire protection, but it was difficult to separate that into areas. Would you be able to
yes, well, the Sierra Conservancy, and it also, one of their other measures was economic development within the environmental context. And I did the bill that established it in 2004. And it runs from Kern County, which Bakersfield is the county seat of, to the Oregon County line, and runs along the Nevada border a lot of the way. And when we created it, it was a certain area. And last year, we added some more, but it was mostly in the north and filling out counties and going a little west, so that all of Modoc came in. I think all of Siskiyou came in, and it might have moved west toward Trinity, or there was some place. And the original act divided the area, the entire area, into districts for county supervisors to serve on the board. And by adding area, it knocked those districts out of whack. And so I have a bill that redraws those 6 districts to evenly split them with the new area. And I got it off the Senate floor last week. And Tahoe has 2 things. It has a regional planning agency, but it has a conservancy. And there's a bill, and there's 10 conservancies. And the biggest ones are the Coastal Conservancy, which in Santa Cruz County we really benefit from. Not the Coastal Commission, Coastal Conservancy. It gave grants for agricultural protection for some of the open space north of Santa Cruz, between Santa Cruz and the San Mateo County line. At one time, it even funded the entranceway to the wharf. I'll be doing that in Santa Cruz. But then the Delta Conservancy. And now there's a bill to establish a conservancy aroround the Salton Sea because they have some unique problems down there. So that's the gist of what the conservancy issues are.
When you say that you got this bill off the Senate floor last week, what does that mean?
That means it's agendized for the Senate, and I stand up and present it, and they take a vote. And there's an interesting story, because Brian Dawley, who was the Republican nominee against Gavin Newsom last year, was my co-author on the bill. And it's really interesting because when I did the Sierra Conservancy 20 years ago next year, a lot of people in the Sierra didn't want it. They were worried. They thought it was an added regulatory layer. They didn't realize the benefits. And so when we were drawing these districts and had local officials, I said, I will die and go to heaven when there is a local official from the Sierra that comes in the legislature after they have served on the board of the Conservancy and appreciates what the Conservancy does. Well, Brian Dawley is that person. He served on the board for 8 years. He came into the legislature, and he really likes the Conservancy. And so I do work with him on it. And I had a lot of fun because here he was, the Republican nominee for governor last year, and I stood up on the floor when I presented the bill, and I said, this is just another Laird Dawley bill. And I could see everybody jerk their head around. It's like, why are those two doing a bill together? And he laughed. I gave him a heads up beforehand I was going to do it. And I actually get along with him very well. And he is pragmatic. And to tell a story, when we were doing the water bond in 2014 and I was Secretary of Resources, we were putting money in there to take down the Klamath dams because these 4 dams, there's been this process to take them down. They block fish from coming upstream. There was the largest fish die-off, I think, can't remember the year, 10 or 12 years ago. And tribes have won water rights that irrigators said this is a huge compromise. And everybody's been working to take down these dams. Oregon, California, Pacific Corp that owns them, a Warren Buffett company, and then the federal administration. But it's not very popular in Brian Dawley's district. So he said, if you name the Klamath dams in the bond, I'm going to have trouble voting for it. But if you don't name them, then I'm good. And so we put in a pot for $250 million for legal settlement. And everybody knew that was mostly about the Klamath Dam, but it didn't name it. So he felt fine. He could vote for the water bond. And so he's one of those elected officials that will problem solve. And even though he and I don't agree on a lot of things, I'm very grateful for it, and I work with him on things.
Well, you said that you would die and go to heaven when that happened. I hope you're meaning literally, figuratively, not literally. Because John, we want you around for many more years. We got work to do.
politically die and go to heaven. And it's because that when I did the Sierra Conservancy, I worked hard to make it a compromise thing, because the conservative senator from the Sierra at the time, Tim Leslie, introduced his own bill that was radically different. And I asked my colleagues, I didn't realize how unique this was at the time, because I had been in the Assembly 2 years, to pass his bill and my bill. So they passed both bills out, and we lined the bills up in terms of one section is on governance, one section's on authority, one section's on boundary, and then we agreed to a compromise. And that bill passed, and it passed with a lot of Republican and Democratic votes. I could have jammed it with Democratic votes, but I wanted it to get off the ground in a good way. And it's very funny, because that was the last year you could name bills for yourself, or it's known in the trade as tombstone. Your tombstone bill. And so I said to him, we should name this after the two of us. And he says, but I really want to be the lead author of the bill. And I said, I'll give you a choice. One of us can be the lead author in the bill, and the other can be the first name in the tombstone. He says, I want the bill. So it is known as the Laird-Leslie Act. And it was the last year you could do that. And now people refer to it as the Laird-Leslie Act. So I guess I got the last laugh.
You got the tombstone.
Nobody notices that I wasn't the lead person on my own bill when it got across the governor's desk.
But you said bills aren't tombstoned anymore? That's
No, you can name it after a thing, like the Mental Health Something Act of 2023, but you can't name it the Laird-Atkins Act or whatever the names are of people that do stuff now.
So, tombstone to bill. California Senator John Laird joining us here on the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club on KZSC Santa Cruz. I'm Dangerous Dan.
I'm Calamity Kyle.
I'm Chaos.
And please join Catherine and
when I ask Dawn Addis if she'll participate later today, I'll say, we got so down in the weeds, we were talking about tombstoning of
That's what we do.
So, kzse.fm/give, point your browser, join the folks who've supported Bushwhackers this morning and help keep radio like this going.
Now, John, I'm very curious about this kind of site of collaboration between the two different, collaborating across the aisle, especially in matters of conservancy. Now, with conservancy, I imagine there's so much like reliance on enforcement on a local level. And so do you find that with issues of conservancy, you're collaborating often? And what kind of concessions do you frequently make in that sector?
Well, the
to
great
get support?
thing about a conservancy is it's not regulatory. It is really to help people.
Sure.
And so your real issues are getting them enough money to do their work and have enough money for projects. I mean, they've taken the lead on wetlands restoration across the Sierra. They've taken the lead on trying to prepare for fires with fuel prevention and prescribed fires and other things, and they do it regionally. And they're the perfect funnel for money because they have locals at the table with the state, and then they can move ahead with these projects. And the real collaboration is having them take the lead on some key things that are state goals and getting them enough money that they can put it through their process and hash it out with different elected officials and make it work.
Right. So when you talk about, like conservancy is designed specifically to help people, is it kind of the type of thing where people are disagreeing because they're on opposite sides politically, but everybody's kind of going after the same thing, and it's just a matter of like how best to express that to where everybody is like, okay, this is how we're going to help people.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think that initially people in the Sierra didn't appreciate what a good thing this would be. And there was a time when I presented it in an assembly hearing in 2004 and said, we love the Coastal Conservancy on the coast because it really helps us do things. I walked out of the hearing room and these people from the Sierra just shouted at me in the hallway because they assumed I was talking about the Coastal Commission. And they were like, no, we don't want that regulation. We don't want them telling us what to do. And I said, two different things. the only thing that's common is the word coastal. And I think people in the Sierra have appreciated it now.
Gotcha. Well, we got the KPFA Morning News headlines coming up in just like 30 seconds. Last word, Senator John Laird.
We're in the heat of the legislative session, and I'll tell you stories about it next time. And I was in Denmark, which is the reason I couldn't be here last month, and visited wind turbines, and can talk to you about how they do offshore wind next time we talk.
Let's do that. And I think there's the May revise. So when we talk the first Friday in June, we have a lot to go through. Senator John Laird, thank you so much for joining us this morning. KZSC.FM, KZSC.FM/give. Point your browser, help us out. Senator Laird, be well, be safe down there in SLO, and we'll talk to you next month.
Thanks, Senator.
Talk to you next month.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast from an interview on the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club on KZSC 88.1 FM in Santa Cruz, California. This interview has been produced by myself, Dangerous Dan Orange. KZSC is a student-run college and community non-commercial educational radio station broadcasting from the UC Santa Cruz campus. You can stream KZSC online at kzsc.org. Thanks for listening.